So, wait, but where is I back on? You get me into these examples. It's just like, what?
1964 war on poverty, yeah.
So with the war on poverty, how do you fight that war? And there were two major ways, both of which involved human development, developmentalists, and educationalists, right? The one was focus on the family. In fact, there's a program where a guy runs around talking about focus on the family on the radio, right? And the idea there was that the conditions of poverty in urban settings, and particularly at that time in capitalist urban settings, would bring in people, have them be in such horrible conditions that family life was disrupted, kids didn't get fed, they didn't get good health, but they also were not trained at all about how to sit down and try to do something like a book where the parents don't read, and it's all disrupted. So one group said, go fix the family. It's a pathological family, right? And in some sense, it's a dysfunctional family if you actually have a chance to become Bill Gates, but you probably don't. So it may be actually functional in one way in the short term. You get your paycheck, go out and spend it. Right? Because who knows, you're not going to give you any work. Go spend it, then you'll sponge off with somebody else and you all swap. Right? Okay, short-term survival, yeah. Long-term survival, not good. People put into that position, moved in from the countryside, given terrible work with not enough money, where the men especially had difficulty, didn't have education, they would get themselves into a lot of trouble, they'd go off to jail, the women are left alone, the grandmas are doing this and that, so they focused on the family. They focused, but then how do you focus on the family? Do you focus by making sure that there's training programs, that the dads can actually get work, that they can bring home so that they can stabilize the situation? Or do you have programs which go in where nice young people like you get trained in an HDP program about the right way to bring up your kids and the right way to talk to them, and you start going out to the housing projects and teaching mothers how to raise their kids? That was one way to work on the family. If you thought that it was like all this economic stuff had created conditions that where, in order to adapt to those conditions, groups of people formed culture of poverty, so-called.
But who determines the right way to raise your kids?
Well, exactly. But that's what all of this stuff is about. Right way. Well, the way that Casey was bringing this up, that what we hear all the time. We'll promote literacy so they'll be eligible for good jobs so that we can break the cycle of poverty. So poverty is seen as this cycle involving the family, and the larger socioeconomic arrangements that lead to that condition in the first place are not on the table. They're not there. They're just assumed. And nobody does know the answer to this. I mean, truly, they don't know the answer to this. In the Soviet Union, there was, from my observation, it was very limited, and only to large cities, because I wasn't allowed to travel very much in the countryside. If you went essentially 100 miles outside of Moscow, you went about 100 years back in time. There are very few cars, hardly any electricity. It's in 1962. People have horse-drawn carts with big wheels and stuff like that. And in Moscow itself, a lot of the people are living in a situation that's very difficult. But the people in charge weren't very rich. It was very odd. So toward the end, there was this expression: we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. And there was a kind of arrangement where things were distributed, but in these really wild ways. But you didn't have what Natalia sort of grew up with, which is oligarchs. People like Mark Zuckerberg are going to have like so many billions of dollars. You go, what are you going to do with all that stuff? Right? That happens in some societies. It didn't happen in Soviet society, and a lot of people thought, oh, that's great, look at that. The rich-poor gap is not as big. The problem was they couldn't maintain the country in competition with what was coming in from the outside. There's too much secrecy. You couldn't use a Xerox machine unless the local police chief and there was one in every organization said, oh, you can make a copy of that. There was no internet for a long time, right? And the Soviet Union, in my view, and the time we have a different view, kind of imploded through its own internal attempts to control everything. And it just could not survive. Couldn't survive economically. And of course, we kept pressing it militarily, which made them spend lots and lots of money on high technology tech stuff, which made other people even poorer. Right? So, in the United States with the war on poverty, the thing was to try to go, a well-known Harvard sociologist, Daniel Moynihan, wrote a report on the family saying, you want to break the cycle of poverty, support the family. I'm for supporting families. The question is how. Do you go in and tell people how to raise their kids, or do you change tax laws and incentives for working and other things so that people themselves take charge of how they're going to rearrange things with more resources? How are you going to do that? That was one way. Let's call it the sociological, anthropological way of doing it. There was another way, and that was through early childhood education. And the idea of giving children of the poor and ethnic minorities, who are, a lot of them are the same people, right? That you're going to give their little children a head start by having them go to these specially enriched preschools. And in these preschools, they'll learn their ABCs, and they'll learn how to talk in long sentences, and they'll love to read books. And so all of the problems that were bedeviling them before will be over by the time they get to kindergarten, and you will have leveled, by giving them a head start, you will have leveled the playing field. And Gina's going like this, and Gina is right. No, didn't do it. Okay? Now, this is really, I think, for all of us with culture and development, that's where research in Africa that we have been doing started to become very important here in the United States, because we were going off and saying, well, look, you say these people can't discriminate between two different things. They live in this impoverished environment out here in the jungle. Yeah, but it's impoverished compared to where you came from, but if you have to be able to mix the right kind of leaves to make a potion for things, you have to be able to tell the leaves apart. Peace Corps teachers and his teachers couldn't do that. They couldn't even learn to do that. Little kids laugh at them, right? So it does bring up exactly this thing. What are you, if you're helping people with something, what are you helping them to do? Are you helping send them down a blind alley? Or is it really going to be able to break out of that? And I don't think there's, good morning, I don't think there's any single answer to that. That's right now, that's like, ooh, very, very heavy. And it's not an answer problem, but culture plays into that heavily, and unequal, unfair tests, unfair situations where you walk in on families who are very, there's a big power differential when you walk in and you're walking into their house to talk, oh my goodness, right? That's not to say you should never do it. It has no effects. It doesn't help anybody with school ever. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what it doesn't do is it doesn't solve the problem. Maybe in little patches it helps some people get into a better situation in life, but maybe it's a part of a larger problem. So I think that that for Casey's stuff, where I would want to go would be, what's the psychological testing? How do you decide? Maybe what I'll do is I'll post the thing that I'm writing. If you want to see a professor writing badly, right? I'm trying to write something quite unusual. I'm trying to summarize something in a fairly short thing that went over years and years, and it's exactly about this problem. It was believed by very, very reputable people in 1964, which is when I started into this game as a professional, that little black children, let's say from New Haven, Connecticut, I was at Yale, teaching at Yale when I first started, that they come to school and they have not acquired a language, any language. Who doesn't acquire a language? Under what conditions does a human being not acquire a language? It has to be extreme deprivation. It has to be Romanian orphans. You all know about Romanian orphans? Anybody here doesn't know about Romanian orphans? Find out about, well, you had actually, you're a major. The Romanians, for a bunch of reasons, created these unbelievably isolating orphanages for little kids. Basically chained them in their beds and didn't talk to them.
Oh.
And those kids are seriously damaged. If you look at it's like if you put rats in isolated cages and didn't give them anything to do, their brains don't develop normally. And what I have is quotations that I was working on this morning before I came in which people are saying, just like rats don't develop the problem-solving abilities and brain cells if you put them in a cage that's isolated, so is the case that poor kids growing up in the ghetto live in an environment which is like a rat isolated in a cage. So their brains they're at risk because they don't get good food, and their brains are at risk, and their culture is this culture where people don't try, and they're freeloaders, and they have no education, right? And that's going on, that story it's right here today. It hasn't gone away. But that's where, again, serious attention to culture and development, and how do you measure it, right? Is an IQ test, what is an IQ test a measure of? Give it a fling here.
Your ability to memorize things and your ability to solve problems.
It's related to be able to do things that require thinking, broadly speaking, right? But if it's, well, how do we measure intelligence?
You mean in terms of an IQ test, or?
Well, that's what I'm asking you. IQ test is one way. What's an IQ test?
IQ test gives you a lot of problems, like puzzles.
Right.
I personally don't think they work very well.
No, I don't care what you personally think for the moment. I do care what you personally think, but just to characterize. So you'll have word ratios. You'll have incomplete geometric figures you have to put together. What are some other ones? Word associations. I say cat, you say dog. And that's a higher score on an IQ test than if I say cat and you say white. It's a white cat. That's a lower answer, right? But where do those tasks come from? Those kinds of questions where somebody asks you to do that kind of stuff. Your moms and dads ask you to do that at home a lot? No. Where do they ask you to do that stuff? In school.
But isn't it also depends on definitely in which environment you are growing up? So
Of course it does. What is intelligent does depend upon the environment. But now let's go to this business of culture and how do we measure the intelligence of poor kids who grew up in a very different environment. How do you do that? Using an IQ test that came out of standardized schools and the vocabularies of the educated people who put together the schools. What IQ tests do is they are a pretty good diagnosis of kids' ability to deal with school-like tasks. But that shouldn't surprise anybody because they all came from school in the first place. They were designed to predict who will do well in school and who won't, with the idea being, this was Binet who started it. You guys are supposed to know all of this as HDP majors. Right? But he started it to try to figure out who are the kids who are not doing well in school, let's give them extra help. There's always been that idea around. But the tests themselves are weird. They're kind of, there's something to them, but we don't know what there is to them. It's just like our problems with culture and overall. So I think this is a hot area
Well, isn't
of
the,
research.
like, I forget the guy who wrote it, but that idea of multiple intelligences.
Howard Gardner.
Yeah, so that they're different people
And he wants
are,
to say
are
that-
good at different things.
Right,
so-
and that is related to research on the brain, the idea of modularity of the brain. So that, and we know that in IQ tests, some people are real good at math, and some people are real good at vocabulary, at language, and some people are real good at both. Those are the ones with the real high IQ. There are really weird things, like there's a relationship between musical ability and mathematics.
I disagree.
What?
I've always had very bad math grades.
It's a
and
cor-
I'm a professional musician.
I understand that, but there is still there's still overall, on the average, there is a correlation.
So,
And people then take the, what?
oh, I was just going to ask a question. So this is making me think of the different ways in which people develop and all of these standardized tests. It makes me think about the emergence of more and more charter schools, which cater to individual needs of children and different learning abilities and development.
So they say.
Okay, so that's what I'm wondering. Did that kind of arise out of this human development research, and
No.
is this a newer phenomenon?
No, I
or-
think I think it's more about the resegregation in a way. It's complicated. It's not one thing. It's partly the resegregation of American society. So more and more, it's neighborhood schools. With charter schools, it's getting out of government regulation. So it allows homeschooling. Mm-hmm. It allows people to create charter schools where God created the earth in 7 days and all of Darwinian biology is off the table.
Okay.
And it's legal, right? Some of them are good, really good. I work with one I think is totally excellent, right? Others of them they're like degree meals for colleges.
So